The Empty House. Part 1. A Visitor for Watson.
In the spring of 1894, all of London was interested in the murder of the Honourable Ronald Adair. I also thought the crime was interesting, but then something else happened as a result of that crime, something that was much more fascinating. In fact, it was the greatest shock of my adventurous life. After my friend Sherlock Holmes disappeared in 1891, I continued to read about crimes in the newspaper. Sometimes I tried to use Holmes's methods to solve a mystery. When I read about the murder of Ronald Adair, I knew that it was just the kind of mystery that Holmes most liked to investigate. I thought sadly that Holmes's death was a great loss to the community. Ronald Adair was the second son of the Earl of Maynooth. He lived with his mother and sister at 427 Park Lane in London. Ronald had many rich and aristocratic friends and enjoyed an active social life. He had no known enemies or bad habits. Yet this very ordinary young aristocrat was murdered between 10 and 11:20 on the night of 30th of March, 1894. Ronald enjoyed playing cards. After dinner, on the day of his death, he played cards at the Bagatelle Card Club with Mr. Murray, Sir John Hardy, and Colonel Moran. He lost about £5, but that was nothing to this rich young aristocrat. A few weeks earlier, he and Colonel Moran, his partner in that particular game, had won £420 in a card game with Godfrey Milner and Lord Balmoral. All this was told at the inquest. On the night of his death, he returned from the club at 10. His mother was out. A servant said that she heard him go upstairs to his living room. The window in the living room was open. At 11:20, Lady Maynooth returned. She went to Ronald's living room to say good night, but she found the door was locked. She knocked on the door and called out, but there was no reply. Worried about her son, she asked two servants to open the door by force. Ronald Adair was found lying near the table. Someone had shot him in the head, but no weapon was found in the room. On the table there was some money and a piece of paper with numbers written opposite the names of his friends at the card club. Apparently, the young man was calculating his winnings and losses when he was shot. No one could understand why he had locked the door. It was possible that the murderer had done this and then escaped through the open window. However, the window was 20 feet above the ground, and immediately below it was a flower bed. There were no footprints in the flower bed. Perhaps someone had shot him through the window. But Park Lane is a very busy street, and no one had heard the shot. It certainly was a mystery. After reading about the inquest in the newspaper, I thought about the crime all day and tried to solve the mystery. In the evening, I went to Park Lane. People were standing in the street, looking up at Ronald Adair's window. As I turned to leave, I bumped into an old man who was standing behind me. He had white hair and a very bent back. He dropped some books. As I helped him to pick them up, I said, "I'm so sorry." He gave me an angry look and walked away. I went home, and 5 minutes later the servant came in to say there was someone to see me. To my surprise, it was the old man who I had bumped into on Park Lane.
"I want to thank you for picking up my book, sir," he said.
"There's no need to thank me," I replied.
"I own the bookshop on the corner of Church Street. Will you buy a few books, sir? Here's one called British Birds."
I took the book and looked at it. When I looked up again, there in front of me was Sherlock Holmes, smiling. I stood up and looked at him in amazement. Then, for the first and last time in my life, I fainted. When I opened my eyes, Holmes was holding a flask of brandy to my lips.
"My dear Watson,"
he said.
"I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to shock you like that."
"Holmes!" I cried. "Is it really you? How did you escape from that terrible abyss?" He sat down opposite me and lit a cigarette. The books, the false white hair, the hat and the coat he used as a disguise were on the table.
"Tonight, we've got work to do,"
he said.
"I'll tell you all about my adventures in the Reichenbach Falls tomorrow."
"No, tell me now. I'm curious."
"Will you come with me tonight?"
"Yes, of course," I said.
"All right, then. I'll tell you what happened. I was never in that terrible abyss."
"Never in it?"
"No,"
said Holmes, smiling.
"My note to you was real. When I wrote it, I thought I was going to die. Professor Moriarty had followed me to the edge of the falls. I knew he wanted to kill me. I asked him if I could write a note to you before I died. I wrote the note and left it with my cigarette case. Then Moriarty ran towards me. He hoped to take me over the edge of the falls with him. He wanted to die enjoying his revenge. However, I know Baritsu, the Japanese art of wrestling. With a few quick moves, I escaped from Moriarty, and he fell into the abyss alone."
"But the footprints!" I cried. I saw with my own eyes that 2 sets of footprints went to the edge of the falls, and none returned."
The moment Professor Moriarty disappeared, I knew that this was a good opportunity for me. Moriarty wasn't the only man who wanted to kill me. There were 3 others, all very dangerous men. I decided that it was a good idea for the world to think that I was dead. I didn't want to leave any footprints, so I climbed up the cliff by the falls. When you wrote about my death, you said that it was impossible to climb that cliff. That wasn't completely true. It was very difficult to climb it, and several times I nearly fell off. But finally, I reached the top. I stayed there and watched as you and the police investigated the scene. When you had all gone back to town, I saw one of Moriarty's associates, one of the 3 men who wanted to kill me. He had seen me escape, and now he tried to succeed where Moriarty had failed. He was at the top of the cliff, and he tried to kill me by rolling rocks to the place where I was. I managed to escape from the cliff, and travelled to Florence without being recognized. I contacted my brother, Mycroft. He's the only one who knew that I was still alive. I had to tell him, so that he could send me the money I needed. I'm sorry, Watson, but it was very important that everyone thought I was dead. For you to write a convincing report of my death, you had to truly believe that I was dead. After Florence, I spent 2 years in Tibet and visited the Dalai Lama. I then travelled through Persia, went to Mecca, and finally to France. There, I read about this fascinating Park Lane mystery, so I returned to London immediately, and here I am. Part 2. Colonel Sebastian Moran.
When he had finished his story, Holmes said,
"Come on, Watson. We have work to do."
We called a cab and drove through the dark streets. My gun was in my pocket, and my heart was beating fast with the thought of adventure. The cab took us near to Baker Street. We got out, and Holmes took me to an empty house. He took a key from his pocket and opened the door. Then we went up the stairs to a large, dark, empty room.
"Do you know why we're here?"
he whispered. "No," I replied.
This house is opposite our old house in Baker Street,
he said.
Look through the window, Watson. I think you'll be surprised by what you see.
I looked through the window and saw the window of Holmes's old room across the street. A strong light was burning in the room, and the blind was pulled down. I noticed the shadow of a man on the blind. Then, to my amazement, I recognized the man. His unique profile was unmistakable. It was Holmes.
It's a bust of me, done by an artist in France,
said Holmes, laughing quietly.
When I arrived in London, I went to Baker Street. At first, Mrs. Hudson was shocked to see me, but now she's calmed down and is following my instructions.
But why have you put the bust there by the window? I asked.
Because my old enemies are following me. They know that I'm still alive. When I got to Baker Street, I saw one of them watching the house. I pulled the blind down and placed the bust behind it so it looks like I'm in my room. The man who's after me tonight, Watson, is the most dangerous man in London. However, what he doesn't know is that we are after him.
I looked through the window again. Holmes! I cried. The bust's moved!
Of course it's moved,
said Holmes impatiently.
I told Mrs. Hudson to move the bust a little every few minutes. She gets down on her knees, so no one can see her shadow on the blind.
We waited for 2 hours. Then suddenly Holmes took my arm and we went to the darkest corner of the room. I heard the sound of someone coming up the stairs. A door opened and shut. In the darkness, I saw the black shape of a man moving across the room. He went to the window and opened it. He took a gun out of his pocket, pointed it at the shadow of the bust of Holmes, and fired. The shot made no sound. At that moment, Holmes jumped like a tiger onto the man's back. The man was old, but he was large and strong. He turned round and put his hands around Holmes's throat. I took my gun out and hit him on the head with it. The man fell to the floor.
"Lestrade!"
cried Holmes.
"Here I am, Mr. Holmes,"
cried Inspector Lestrade, running up the stairs. He came into the room, followed by 2 policemen.
"It's good to see you back in London, sir."
The policeman helped the prisoner to get up. Inspector Lestrade lit a candle, and at last we were able to see the prisoner. His face was old and lined. He had cruel blue eyes, and he looked at Holmes with hatred and amazement.
"You devil!"
he cried.
"You clever, clever devil!"
"Hello, Colonel,"
said Holmes.
"I haven't had the pleasure of seeing you since that day at the Reichenbach Falls."
Then he turned to Lestrade and me and said,
"Gentlemen, let me introduce you to Colonel Sebastian Moran. The colonel was once part of the British Indian Army, where he was famous for shooting tigers."
Moran continued to look at Holmes. With his cruel eyes, he looked a lot like a tiger himself. Holmes picked up the colonel's gun from the floor.
"A good weapon,"
he said.
"It can shoot silently and from a great distance."
"If you've nothing more to say, sir,"
said Lestrade.
"we'll take the prisoner to the police station."
"What will be the charge?"
asked Holmes. Lestrade looked surprised.
"We'll charge him with attempted murder of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, of course,"
he said.
"No, I don't want people to read my name. Congratulations, Lestrade. You've got him."
"But got who, Mr. Holmes?"
"You've caught the man the whole of London is looking for. The man who shot the Honourable Ronald Adair. Ever since Colonel Moran left the Indian Army, he has won money by cheating at cards. Adair probably discovered that the colonel cheated, so the colonel shot him to keep him quiet. That night, Adair was in his living room, calculating how much money he owed to each of his friends. He was an honest man. He didn't want to keep money that came from the dishonesty of his partner. He locked the door to stop his mother walking in while he made his calculations. The colonel did not enter the room, but shot him through the open window from across the street with his powerful gun. There you have it, Lestrade. The criminal, the weapon, and the reason for the crime. Come on, Watson. Let's go to our rooms across the street. Mrs. Hudson's waiting for us. Charles Augustus Milverton. Part 1. Holmes negotiates.
One winter evening, Holmes said to me,
Charles Augustus Milverton is coming to see us, Watson.
"Who's he?" I asked.
He's the most disgusting man I've ever met. I've met over 50 murderers, but none of them has ever disgusted me as much as this man. He's the king of all blackmailers. Many of the richest ladies and gentlemen in England are terrified of him. This is his method. He pays large sums of money for letters containing secrets about rich and noble families. Servants often find these letters. Milverton once paid £700 to a servant for a note 2 lines long. But the note was from a duchess to her lover. Now Milverton is very rich, so he doesn't need to use a letter as soon as he gets it. Sometimes he waits for years before acting. He always waits until the letter in question can bring him the most money.
"But the man's a criminal!" I cried. "Surely the police can stop him."
Only if he blackmails someone who's innocent. That person could report Milverton to the police without fear. Unfortunately, Milverton's victims aren't innocent, and they don't want to involve the police in their personal lives.
"Why is he coming here?" I asked.
Because Lady Eva Brackwell, one of the most beautiful ladies in London, has asked for my help. She's engaged to be married to the Earl of Dovercourt. Milverton has some love letters that the lady wrote to another man. Milverton says he'll send the letters to the Earl of Dovercourt unless Lady Brackwell pays him £7,000. Lady Brackwell has asked me to meet him and negotiate.
Just then the servant opened the door, and Milverton entered the room. He was a pale, fat man of about 50, with a false smile on his face. His little grey eyes were nervous and intelligent. He offered his hand to Holmes, but Holmes ignored it.
Lady Eva has asked me to negotiate with you,
said Holmes.
She tells me that you want £7,000. What will happen if she doesn't pay?
There will be no wedding,
said Milverton, smiling.
I'll advise Lady Eva to tell her future husband everything, and hope he is able to forgive her,
said Holmes.
Clearly, you haven't read the letters,
said Milverton, still smiling.
They are very interesting. But if you've decided to advise your client not to pay, there's nothing more to discuss.
He stood up and took his coat from the back of the chair.
Wait,
cried Holmes.
We certainly don't want a scandal.
Milverton sat down again.
Lady Eva isn't rich,
said Holmes.
£2,000 is the most she can pay. It's a lot of money. Why not accept it? Your only alternative is to ruin the lady's good name without getting any money out of it.
You're wrong, Mr. Holmes,
said Milverton.
There are several other ladies in similar situations at the moment. I'm sure the example of Lady Eva will help them to decide what to do. They'll decide to pay me.
Holmes jumped to his feet.
Stand in front of the door, Watson,
he cried.
Don't let him leave. We'll take the letters from him.
Don't be foolish, Mr. Holmes,
said Milverton.
I certainly didn't bring the letters with me. And now, if you'll excuse me, I've got 1 or 2 other little business meetings this evening.
He took his coat and went to the door. I stood in front of him, but Holmes told me to let him pass. Milverton smiled and left the room. Holmes sat by the fire for some time, thinking hard. Then he went into his room and, a short time afterwards, came out wearing a disguise. He was dressed as a workman.
"I'll be back later, Watson,"
he said, and he disappeared into the night. For several days, Holmes spent a lot of time out in this disguise. One evening, he came home, changed into his normal clothes, and sat down by the fire with me.
"Watson,"
He said.
"I'm engaged to be married."
I looked at him in great surprise. "My dear friend, congratulations!" I cried.
"To one of Milverton's servants."
"Good Lord!
"I needed information, Watson."
But surely you didn't need to get engaged," I said.
"No, it was necessary. I've spent the last few evenings talking to her, and now I know all about Milverton's house."
"But what about the poor girl, Holmes?"
"She has another young man, Watson. He'll ask her to marry him as soon as I disappear. I won't see the girl again. Tonight, I'll burgle Milverton's house.
"What if the police catch you?"
I can think of no other way to get the letters, Watson. Personal risk is of no importance when a lady is in such desperate need of help."
I thought about it for a moment, then said, "All right, when do we start?"
"You're not coming."
said Holmes. "Oh, yes, I am. If you don't let me share this adventure, I'll go to the police and tell them what you're doing." Holmes laughed and said,
"All right. We've shared these rooms for many years, and now perhaps we'll share the same cell in prison." Part 2. Justice for Milverton.
At midnight, we went to Milverton's house. On the way, Holmes told me the plan.
Agatha, that's the girl I'm engaged to, says that Milverton goes to bed early and sleeps very heavily. She says it's almost impossible to wake him. Next to his bedroom on the ground floor is his study. He keeps the letters there, in a safe. There's a door from the study into the garden, but it'll be locked, so it's much safer for us to go in through the back door.
The house was dark and silent. Holmes took out his instruments. He removed a panel of glass from the back door, reached in through the hole, and unlocked the door. We entered the house quietly. I followed Holmes through several dark rooms to Milverton's study. There was a fire, and we could see by its light. A tall green safe stood against one wall. The door to the garden was in the opposite wall. I decided to unlock it so that we could escape through it. But, to my surprise, it was already unlocked.
"That's strange,"
Holmes said quietly.
"but we've got no time to lose. I'll open the safe, and you listen at the door."
Holmes took out his instruments and began to work on the safe. After some time, I heard a click. The door of the safe was now unlocked. Suddenly, we heard the sound of footsteps coming towards the study. Holmes quickly put his instruments in his pockets, and we ran to hide behind the long window curtains. Milverton entered the room and turned on the light. We could smell his cigar. I wondered why he had not gone to bed early, as he usually did. Through a narrow gap between the two curtains, we saw him sitting at his desk, smoking his cigar. Behind him was the safe. I saw that it was not completely closed. At any moment, Milverton might turn and notice this. But he did not turn. He just sat, smoked, and occasionally looked at his watch. There was a gentle knock on the door to the garden. Milverton opened it.
"You're late,"
he said. Then he sat down at his desk again. A woman with a veil over her face stood in front of the desk.
Come on, it's late,
said Milverton in an angry voice.
You say you have letters from your mistress, the Countess Thalbert. Let me see them.
The woman lifted up her veil.
Good Lord, it's you!
Cried Milverton.
You ruined my life,
said the woman in a quiet, intense voice. Her dark eyes were full of anger.
Well, it was your decision, and you decided not to pay me,
said Milverton.
but I couldn't pay, so you sent the letters to my husband, the most honourable gentleman who ever lived. Those letters broke his heart, and he died. You'll ruin no more lives like you ruined mine,
she cried. Then she took a small gun out of her pocket. I wanted to jump out from behind the curtain to stop her, but Holmes held my hand firmly. I knew what he was thinking. This was justice. The man was evil and deserved his fate. It was nothing to do with us. And anyway, we had our own work to do in that room.
Take this,
she cried, and shot him dead. As soon as she had left through the door to the garden, Holmes and I came out from behind the curtain. He went to the door that led to the rest of the house and locked it. He then went to the safe, took out all the letters, and threw them into the fire. As he was doing this, we could hear footsteps and voices in the corridor outside. The sound of the gunshot had woken up the servants. As we left the room by the door to the garden, Holmes took the key and locked the door from the outside.
Come on, Watson,
he said.
We can escape over the garden wall.
But there were people in the garden. One of them cried out, and then several ran after us, shouting, "Stop!
Stop!
Stop!" We reached the garden wall and climbed over it just in time. The next morning, after breakfast, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard came to see us.
Mr. Holmes, there's been a very interesting murder. Will you help me with the investigation? Someone has shot Charles Augustus Milverton in his house. The murderers burnt a lot of letters that Milverton was using to blackmail people. We think the murderers were probably gentlemen of noble families trying to stop a scandal.
Murderers?
Asked Holmes.
In the plural.
Yes, the servants saw him running across the garden,
said Lestrade.
They didn't see the man in front very clearly, but they've given a description of the man behind him. He was of medium height and robust with a moustache.
That's not a very clear description,
said Holmes.
It could be Watson.
That's true,
said Lestrade, laughing.
I knew Milverton,
said Holmes.
He was a terrible criminal, but the law could never touch him. In this case, private revenge seems justified. I'm afraid I can't help you.
When the inspector had left, Holmes took a book from the shelf and opened it. It was full of photographs of ladies and gentlemen in high society. He found the picture he was looking for and showed it to me. It was a lady of a noble family. She had been the wife of a well-respected politician and aristocrat. In the picture, she wore a splendid dress and diamonds. I recognized her as the woman in Milverton's study the night before. I looked up at Holmes. He put a finger to his lips to say that we must never tell our secret.
The Second Stain. Part 1. Diplomatic Secrets.
One morning, two very well-dressed visitors came to our rooms in Baker Street. Lord Bellinger, who was then the Prime Minister, and the Right Honourable Trelawney Hope, who was the Minister for European Affairs.
This morning at 8, I discovered that I'd lost an important secret document.
Trelawney Hope explained.
I told the Prime Minister immediately, and he said we should come to you, Mr. Holmes. So here we are.
Have you told the police?
Asked Holmes.
No,
Said the Prime Minister.
it's impossible to do so. Telling the police means telling the public, and we can't do that.
Why not, sir?
Because the document in question is so important that its publication could cause a war.
I see.
said Holmes.
Now, Mr. Trelawney Hope, please tell me more about this missing document.
Certainly.
Said Trelawney Hope.
The document is a letter from someone in a foreign government. I received it 6 days ago. It was so important that I was afraid to leave it in the safe. I carried it home with me every night and kept it in a briefcase in my bedroom. It was in the briefcase last night at dinner time, but this morning, when I opened the briefcase, the letter was gone. The briefcase was on the dressing table all night. I'm a light sleeper, and so is my wife. No one can enter the room without waking us up, and yet the letter's gone.
Who knew about the letter?
Asked Holmes.
No one in the house.
Not even your wife?
No, I didn't tell my wife about the letter until I discovered that it was missing this morning.
Who in England knows about the letter?
The members of the cabinet were told about it yesterday. 2 or 3 members of my own department know about it.
And abroad?
I'm convinced that no one abroad knows about it except the man who wrote it.
Now, sir,
Said Holmes.
I must ask what this letter is, and why it's so important.
The two politicians looked at each other quickly. Then the Prime Minister said,
All you need to know, Mr. Holmes, is that the letter is in a long, pale blue envelope.
Yes, sir.
Said Holmes.
That kind of description will be useful, but I must know what the letter says.
That's a government secret.
Said the Prime Minister. Holmes stood up and said with a smile,
Well, gentlemen, you're very busy, I know. I can't help you, and so there's no reason to continue this conversation.
All right,
cried the Prime Minister.
I'll have to trust you, and your colleague, Dr. Watson. The letter is from a foreign head of state who's angry about some of our government's activities abroad. The letter's so offensive that its publication will cause a war.
Holmes wrote a name on a piece of paper and gave it to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister read it and said,
Yes, him.
Have you told him that his letter has disappeared?
Yes, I sent him a telegram in code.
Perhaps he wants the letter to be published.
No, we think he wrote the letter when he was angry, and now he feels sorry he wrote it. He doesn't want a war.
If the letter's published, who will benefit?
His enemies. If Britain goes to war with his country, his enemies will benefit. Now, Mr. Holmes, we've told you everything. Please tell us what to do.
Holmes looked at the Prime Minister sadly and said,
Prepare for war. The letter was stolen last night. The person who stole it has probably already sold it to an international spy. I'll start my investigations with 3 of the most famous spies I know. If one of them is missing, especially if he has disappeared since last night, I'll be able to tell you where the letter has gone, but it's very unlikely that I can get it back.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes.
said the Prime Minister.
Please let us know the results of your investigations as soon as possible.
When the 2 men had gone, Holmes took his coat and said,
I'll go and see the 3 spies I mentioned.
Who are they? I asked, picking up the newspaper.
Oberstein, Larrotière, and Eduardo Lucas.
Well, you won't see Eduardo Lucas, I said, pointing to a paragraph on the front page of the newspaper. He was murdered in his house last night. My friend has surprised me so many times over the years that I felt a special satisfaction in surprising him. He took the newspaper and read the paragraph. At 11:45 p.m. on Monday night, a policeman was walking past the house of Mr. Eduardo Lucas on Godolphin Street and noticed that the front door was open. He knocked, but got no answer. He entered the house and called out. No one replied. He saw a light in the drawing room, went in, and found the room was very untidy. Mr. Lucas lay on the floor. Someone had stabbed him in the heart with one of his oriental knives. The murderer had taken the knife off the wall in Mr. Lucas's drawing room, where it was hanging as an ornament. Nothing was stolen.
Watson,
said Holmes.
this can't be a coincidence. The stolen letter and Lucas's death must be connected, and we must find the connection. Part 2. Lady Hilda.
Not long after the two politicians had gone, the servant came in and announced that a lady wanted to speak to us. It was Lady Hilda, the Right Honourable Trelawney Hope's wife. She was the most beautiful woman in London, tall, graceful, and elegant. She was very pale and agitated.
Has my husband been here, Mr. Holmes?
She asked.
Yes, madam.
Please tell me what he told you. I must know. I'm so worried about him.
I can't do that, madam. I promised to tell no one.
This morning he was very upset about a missing letter. Will the loss of this letter be bad for his career?
It may be,
said Holmes.
What was in the letter?
I can't tell you, madam.
Then I'll take no more of your time,
she said, walking to the door.
Please don't tell my husband that I came to speak to you.
When she was gone, Holmes said to me,
Now, why do you think she came here, Watson?
Just what she said. She's worried about her husband. It seems very natural.
Yes, but it was more than that. She was very agitated. The lady is an aristocrat, Watson, and English aristocrats don't usually show emotion. Well, I'm going to Godolphin Street. Goodbye.
For 3 days, Holmes spent most of his time investigating the Lucas murder. He did not speak to me about the case, but I knew by his silence and his expression that his investigations were not going well. On the 4th day, when I was reading the newspaper over breakfast, I found this interesting paragraph. Yesterday, the servants of Madame Henri Fournay, who lives on the Rue Austerlitz in Paris, went to the police. They reported that their mistress had gone mad. The servants said that on Tuesday, Madame Fournay had returned from a visit to London. She was hysterical. Investigations showed that Monsieur Fournay and Eduardo Lucas were really the same person. A comparison of photographs has confirmed this beyond doubt. For some reason, the dead man had lived a double life in London and Paris. Madame Fournay is now believed to be responsible for his death. I read the paragraph aloud to Holmes and said, "What do you think of that?"
It doesn't help us much,
said Holmes. "Surely it explains Lucas's death."
The man's death is not as important as this missing document. Only one important thing has happened in the last 3 days, and that is nothing. Nothing has happened. I get frequent reports from the government, and they say everything is calm. That means the letter hasn't reached any European government. Why not? Was Lucas's death really just a coincidence? Or has his mad wife stolen the letter? If so, is the letter in her house in Paris? And how can I search for it without attracting the attention of the French police? This really is the most difficult case. Put on your hat, Watson, and let's go to Godolphin Street. I've just received a note from Lestrade. He says that he's seen something interesting.
We met Inspector Lestrade in the drawing room. The floor was wooden with a square carpet in the middle of the room. There was a large stain on the carpet, the only sign that there had been a murder.
Hello, gentlemen,
said Lestrade.
Have you heard the news from France? The case is closed. Everything's explained now. The mad wife killed him.
Then why did you ask me to come?
Said Holmes.
Just a little matter.
Said Lestrade.
Can you see that stain on the carpet?
Yes.
There was a lot of blood there, but when we moved the carpet, we noticed that there's no corresponding stain on the wooden floor below.
Lestrade lifted the carpet and showed that there was no bloodstain on the floor.
But that's impossible.
Cried Holmes.
The underside of the carpet is just as stained as the upper side. There must be a stain on the floor.
Lestrade laughed.
There is a second stain,
He said.
but it's in the wrong place. Look!
Lestrade turned over another part of the carpet. Below it, there was a large bloodstain on the floor.
How do you explain that, Mr. Holmes?
It's simple enough.
Replied Holmes.
The two stains were together, but someone has turned the carpet around. Since the carpet isn't attached to the floor, it was easy to do.
We know that, Mr. Holmes.
Said Lestrade.
But who moved the carpet and why?
Suddenly, Holmes's expression changed, and he became very excited.
Was there a policeman guarding the house all the time?
Yes.
Then go and talk to him, Lestrade. Tell him he was wrong to let people into this room and leave them alone here. Tell him you know that someone's been here.
Lestrade walked out, and a moment later we heard his loud and angry voice in the next room. Holmes quickly moved the carpet and examined the wooden floor under it. He lifted up one of the wooden floor tiles. It opened like a little box. Holmes put his hand inside, then quickly took it out again.
Empty,
He cried.
Watson, help me to get the carpet back in place. Quickly.
When Lestrade came into the room with the policeman seconds later, Holmes was sitting calmly in a chair, looking bored.
Tell these gentlemen what you did.
Said Lestrade. The policeman said,
A young woman came to the door yesterday evening. She asked me if this was Mr. Lucas's house. I said it was. Then she asked if she could see the room where the murder took place. I showed it to her. As soon as she saw that stain on the carpet, she fainted. I ran to the pub to get some brandy for her, but when I came back, she was gone.
What did this woman look like?
asked Holmes.
She was a tall, very beautiful young woman, sir.
Said the policeman.
Thank you.
Said Holmes.
Come on, Watson. Let's go. Part 3. The Briefcase.
Godolphin Street is a short walk from Whitehall Terrace, where Trelawney Hope lived. We went straight to his house and asked for his wife.
Mr. Holmes,
She cried when we entered the drawing room.
why have you come to my house?
I had no choice, madam. The government's asked me to find an important document. I must, therefore, ask you to give it to me.
The lady jumped to her feet, and her beautiful face turned pale.
You insult me, Mr. Holmes.
She cried.
Come on, madam. Give me the letter.
I'll call the servants, and they will ask you to leave.
She said, putting her hand on the bell.
Don't do that, Lady Hilda.
Said Holmes.
If you work with me, I can help you. If you work against me, I'll have to tell everyone what you've done.
She stood there, looking at Holmes angrily, but she did not ring the bell.
What do you know?
She said.
I know that you went to Eduardo Lucas and gave him the document. I know that you returned to his house last night and took the document from its hiding place, under the carpet. Come on, Lady Hilda. My only interest is to return the document to your husband. Be honest with me. It's your only chance.
She went to the desk, unlocked it, and took out a long, pale blue envelope.
Help me, Mr. Holmes.
She cried.
When is your husband coming back?
Asked Holmes.
In about 15 minutes.
Said Lady Hilda.
He's bringing the Prime Minister home for lunch.
Then be quick. Get the briefcase from your bedroom. You have a key for it, don't you? Get it quickly.
She ran out of the room and returned a minute later with the briefcase and the key. Holmes opened it and put the pale blue envelope inside it, between the pages of another document. Lady Hilda took the briefcase back to the bedroom, then returned to the drawing room. There were still 10 minutes left before her husband returned.
I'll protect you, Lady Hilda,
said Holmes.
but, in return, you must tell me the truth about what happened.
I love my husband very much,
Said Lady Hilda.
but if he discovers what I've done, he'll never forgive me. That man, Eduardo Lucas, wrote to me some time ago. He had a letter that I had written before my marriage, a love letter to another man. He said he would send that letter to my husband if I didn't follow his instructions. He had a spy in my husband's office who knew that my husband took home an important document in a pale blue envelope every night. Lucas said, "Bring it to me and I'll give you back your love letter." I took the document to Godolphin Street and gave it to Lucas. He then gave me my letter. Just then there was a sound in the corridor. Lucas moved the carpet and put the document in a hiding place under one of the tiles in the floor. Then the door opened and a woman ran in, screaming hysterically. "At last I found you with her," she cried. She took a knife from the wall and ran towards him. I ran from the house in terror. When my husband discovered that the document was gone, I realized how very important it was. Then I read about the murder in the newspaper. Last night I went back to Godolphin Street and took the document.
We heard sounds in the corridor outside, and Mr. Trelawney Hope came in with the Prime Minister.
Any news, Mr. Holmes?
Asked Trelawney Hope.
Yes, I'm certain that the document never left your briefcase.
Said Holmes. The two politicians looked at Holmes. They were confused.
I can promise you, Mr. Holmes, that the document wasn't in the briefcase on Tuesday morning.
Said Trelawney Hope.
Have you looked in the briefcase since then?
Asked Holmes.
No, there was no need. I knew that the document wasn't there.
Go and get the briefcase, Hope.
Said the Prime Minister. Trelawney Hope left the room.
This is a waste of time,
He said, when he returned with the briefcase. He opened it and emptied it onto the table.
You see, all the other documents are here, but not... Good Lord!
The pale blue envelope fell out from between the pages of another document. The Prime Minister cried,
It's the letter! Congratulations, Hope.
Thank you, sir, but this is impossible. Mr. Holmes, you're amazing. How did you know it was there?
Because I knew it was nowhere else.
Said Holmes.
Come on, Holmes.
Said the Prime Minister.
Tell us how the letter got back in the briefcase.
As Holmes picked up his hat and turned to go, he said,
We, too, have our diplomatic secrets. The Dancing Men. Part 1. Mr. Hilton Cubitt's Promise.
One morning, Holmes put a piece of paper on the table beside me and said,
What do you think that is?
It looks like a child's drawing, I said. What else could it be?
That
Said Holmes.
is what Mr. Hilton Cubitt of Ridlingthorpe Manor in Norfolk wants to know. He sent this to me through the post, and he himself will arrive by the first train today. The doorbell is ringing, Watson. It's probably him.
A moment later, a tall gentleman entered. He shook hands with both of us and sat down. Then, pointing to the piece of paper on the table, said,
Well, Mr. Holmes, I hear you are good at solving mysteries. What do you think of those little drawings?
They're very strange, but surely not important. Why are you so worried about them?
Asked Holmes.
I'm not. But my wife is. They frighten her. She says nothing, but I can see the terror in her eyes. That's why I must find out what they are.
Holmes held the piece of paper up to the light. The drawings were in pencil, and they looked like this. Holmes examined them for some time and then said,
This will be a very interesting and unusual case. Please tell me the whole story, Mr. Cubitt.
I've been married for a year now. I met my wife, a young American lady named Elsie Patrick, at a hotel in London where we were both staying. I fell in love with her. We got married quietly in London, and then we went to Ridlingthorpe Manor, my house in Norfolk. My family has been at Ridlingthorpe Manor for 5 centuries. It might seem foolish to you, Mr. Holmes, but I married my wife without knowing anything about her past or her family. Elsie was very honest with me. She said she wanted to forget about her past. She promised me that she herself had never behaved badly, but the past was very painful to her, and she preferred not to think about it. The day before our wedding, she said, "If you marry me, you mustn't ask me questions about my past. I want to forget about it." I agreed, and we got married the next day. We've been very happy. But a month ago, Elsie got a letter from America. When she read it, she turned white and threw the letter into the fire. She said nothing about the letter, and neither did I, because a promise is a promise. But since then, she has looked frightened all the time. A week ago, I found a series of dancing men drawn on the windowsill. I told the servant to wash them off. When I told my wife about it, she became very serious and said, "If you find any more of them, please show them to me." Then yesterday morning, I found this piece of paper in the garden. I showed it to Elsie, and she fainted. So I sent it to you, Mr. Holmes. Please help me. I'm not a rich man, but if Elsie's in any danger, I'll spend all my money to protect her.
He was a good man from the old English countryside, simple, honest, and gentle. His love for his wife showed in his sincere blue eyes. Holmes had listened closely to his story. He then sat for some time, thinking silently.
Don't you think, Mr. Cubitt,
He said at last,
that the best thing to do is to ask your wife to tell you her secret?
No. A promise is a promise, Mr. Holmes. I promised not to ask her about the past, but I didn't promise not to ask you to help me.
I'll happily help you,
said Holmes.
First, have you noticed any strangers near your house recently?
No?
These dancing men obviously have a meaning. If they are a code, I can solve it, but it will take some time, and I'll need more examples of the code. I suggest that you go home. If any more dancing men appear, make an exact copy of them and send it to me.
2 weeks later, Mr. Cubitt came to see us at Baker Street again. He was looking worried and depressed.
It's terrible, Mr. Holmes. My wife's so frightened, and there's nothing I can do to help her.
Has she told you her secret?
Asked Holmes.
No. There were times when I thought she wanted to speak, but she couldn't. She often talks about my old and well-respected family and how important the family's good name is to me.
Have you discovered anything new?
Yes, I've got several new series of dancing men,
said Mr. Cubitt.
The morning after I got home from my first visit to you, I saw a new set of dancing men drawn on the door. Here's a copy of it.
Excellent,
cried Holmes.
2 mornings later, another appeared. Here's a copy.
Holmes laughed with pleasure.
3 days later,
said Mr. Cubitt,
I found a new message on a piece of paper in the garden. Here it is. The dancing men are exactly the same as in the last one. After that, I sat in my study all night in the dark with a gun in my hand. The window of my study looks out over the garden. At 2 o'clock in the morning, my wife came in and asked me to come to bed. I told her that I was waiting for the person who drew the dancing men. Suddenly, her face went white. Through the window, she had seen someone in the garden. I ran to the door, but my wife held me back. When I went into the garden, The man was gone. On the door was the same series of dancing men that had appeared twice before. I looked all over the garden for him, but I couldn't find him. He was definitely there, though, because the next morning I found a new set of dancing men, drawn under the ones on the door. Here's a copy.
Holmes's eyes were full of excitement.
Excellent. Now, Mr. Cubitt, go home to your wife and leave these dancing men with me. In a few days, I'll come to visit you at Ridlingthorpe Manor.
As soon as Hilton Cubitt had left us, Holmes put all the sets of dancing men on the table and spent 2 hours doing complicated calculations. He used hundreds of sheets of paper. He was so deeply involved in his work that he completely forgot I was there. Sometimes he looked hopeful and sang a little song as he worked. Sometimes he sat still for 20 minutes, looking disappointed and confused. Finally, he jumped up and wrote a telegram.
If I'm right, Watson, there's no time to lose. We must explain everything to Mr. Cubitt immediately.
The next day, a letter came in reply to the telegram. Mr. Cubitt said that nothing special had happened at Ridlingthorpe Manor, except that he had found a piece of paper in the garden with a long series of dancing men on it. He sent it with the letter. It looked like this. Holmes looked closely at the dancing men for a few minutes, then suddenly jumped to his feet, crying,
We must go to Norfolk immediately, Watson.
His face was pale, and he looked worried.
Part 2. Murder at Ridlingthorpe Manor.
As I come to the conclusion of this story, I'm sorry not to have a happier ending to give to my readers. We went to Norfolk by the first train. When we got off at the station master asked us, "Are you the detectives from London?"
Why do you ask? What's happened?
said Holmes. "It's about Mr. Cubitt and his wife," replied the station master. "Their servants say that she shot him, and then she shot herself. Mr. Cubitt's dead, and she may not survive." In the cab, Holmes was completely silent. I have never seen him look so depressed. At last, we came to Ridlingthorpe Manor, a fine old house with beautiful gardens by the sea. Outside the front door, we met Inspector Martin of the Norfolk Police. He was very surprised when he heard my friend's name.
Why, Mr. Holmes,
he said.
The crime was only committed at 3 this morning. How could you hear of it in London and get here so soon?
I thought it might happen. I came here to try and stop it.
Then you must have important information that we don't know about. Perhaps we could work on the case together, Mr. Holmes.
Certainly.
Holmes replied.
Please, could I hear the evidence and examine the scene of the crime?
As we entered the house, we met the doctor. He said that Mrs. Cubitt's injuries were serious, but that she would live.
The bullet passed through the front of her brain,
he said.
It'll probably be some time before she is conscious again.
Inspector Martin said,
One gun was found in the room. Someone had fired 2 bullets from it. Mr. Cubitt was shot through the heart. The gun was on the floor between Mr. Cubitt and his wife. Either she shot him and then shot herself, or he shot her, then shot himself. There's no way of knowing.
Who found them?
asked Holmes.
The servant, Miss Saunders.
Please, ask her to come here.
Miss Saunders told her story clearly. She was woken up by the loud sound of a gun, and a minute later she heard another shot. As she went downstairs, she smelt gunpowder. She said that the smell was very strong on the stairs. The door of the study was open, and a candle was burning. Mr. Cubitt lay dead in the centre of the room. Mrs. Cubitt, lay against the wall by the window. She was horribly injured, and the side of her face was red with blood. The window was shut and locked on the inside. Miss Saunders called for the doctor and the police. They carried Mrs. Cubitt upstairs to her bed. She was wearing a dress. Her husband was wearing pyjamas and a dressing gown. Miss Saunders had never heard her master and mistress argue. She had always thought they were a happy couple. We then went to the study and examined the scene of the crime.
2 bullets were fired.
Said Inspector Martin.
1 killed Mr. Cubitt and 1 injured Mrs. Cubitt. We can be sure of this because 2 bullets are missing from the gun.
What about the bullet in the windowsill?
Asked Holmes calmly. Inspector Martin looked at the windowsill.
Good Lord!
He cried.
How did you see that?
Because I looked for it.
Holmes replied.
A 3rd shot was fired, which means a 3rd person was present,
Continued the inspector.
Exactly.
Said Holmes.
Miss Saunders said that the smell of gunpowder was very strong on the stairs, right?
Yes, sir, that's right.
Well, that could only happen if both the door and the window of the study were open, creating a draft. When I heard that, I thought that there was probably a 3rd person outside the open window.
Amazing,
said the inspector.
If someone in the room fired a shot at someone outside the window and missed, where would the bullet go? Into the windowsill, perhaps? So I looked at the windowsill and saw the bullet hole.
But who closed and locked the window?
Asked the inspector.
Mrs. Cubitt.
Replied Holmes.
She was acting on instinct.
Then, turning to the table, he pointed to a woman's handbag.
Is this Mrs. Cubitt's?
He asked. When the inspector said it was, Holmes emptied the handbag onto the table. It contained 20 £50 banknotes and nothing else. Holmes smiled and said,
Let's go and look at the ground outside the window.
There was a flower bed outside the study window. It was covered in large footprints.
Is there a hotel nearby called Elridge's?
Asked Holmes.
No, sir,
Said the inspector.
but a farmer called Elridge lives not far from here.
Is the farm far from the village?
Yes, sir.
So perhaps the people there haven't yet heard the news of last night's events.
Perhaps not.
Holmes thought for a moment. Then he took a pen and a piece of paper. He put all the sets of dancing men on the table and began to write. After a while he said,
Could one of the servants please take this to Elridge's farm?
Certainly, sir.
I noticed that the envelope was addressed to Abe Slaney, Elridge's farm. Holmes then said to Miss Saunders,
If someone comes and asks to see Mrs. Cubitt, say nothing of the events of last night. I want you to take the person to the living room and ask him to wait there.
Turning to the inspector and myself, he said,
Let's go and wait in the living room. I think I can tell you some interesting things while we are waiting. Part 3. The Final Coded Message.
Holmes told Inspector Martin about our previous meetings with Mr. Cubitt in Baker Street. Then he put the sets of dancing men on the table in front of us.
Gentlemen, these strange little figures are a code. I know something about codes. In fact, I've written a book on the subject. When I saw the first Dancing Men message, I understood 3 things. That the dancing men were a code, that the message I had was too short to be analyzed, and that this symbol was probably the letter E.
He pointed to the symbol in question.
As you probably know, E is the most common letter in the English language. Of the 15 dancing men in the first message, 4 of them were identical. So it was reasonable to think that that symbol represented E. Some of the dancing men are holding little flags. I decided that the flags represented a space before the beginning of the next word.
Holmes now showed us another dancing men message.
This one had no flag, so I decided it was one word. Notice that the second and fourth dancing men are the symbol for the letter E. I made a list of possible 5-letter words in which the second and fourth letters are E. The word never seemed to make the most sense as a one-word message. If this was correct, I now also knew the symbols for N, V, and R. I thought that perhaps these messages were written to Mrs. Cubitt by some person from her past life. This person probably called her by her first name, Elsie. Therefore, I searched the messages for a 5-letter word in which the first and fifth letters were E. I found 3 examples. In this way, I discovered the symbols for L, S, and I. The word before Elsie was 4 letters long and ended in E. Surely, I thought, this must be come. Now I could identify the symbols for C, O, and M. At that point, I copied out the first message, translating it from dancing men to English letters, when I knew the letter, and dashes when I didn't. Like this. Dash M, dash ERE, dash dash E, SL dash NE dash. Now, the first letter can only be A, because the only 2-letter word ending in M in English is am. The first letter of the third word and the third letter of the fourth word were therefore also A. To make sense with am, the first letter of the second word had to be H. Am here. So the message now looked like this. Am here. A-E, S-L-A-N-E dash. The last 2 words were clearly a name. Abe is an American abbreviation of the name Abraham, and Slaney is a surname. So the completed first message is this. Am here, Abe Slaney. I now knew so many letters that it was easy to guess the missing ones. The second message, when translated, looked like this. A-E-L-R-I-E-S. When I tried T and G as the missing letters, the message made sense. I now knew 3 things about the person who Mrs. Cubitt was so afraid of. I knew his name. I knew that he was an American, because her past life had been in America, and Abe is an American abbreviation of Abraham. And I also knew where to find him. I sent a telegram to my friend Wilson Hargreave of the New York Police and asked him if he had ever heard the name Abe Slaney. This was his reply.
Holmes took a telegram out of his pocket and read it aloud. Abe Slaney is the most dangerous criminal in Chicago.
On the day I got this telegram, I also got a letter from Mr. Cubitt with the last message enclosed in it. I translated it like this. Elsie, dash, R-E, dash, A-R-E, to meet thy, G-O, dash. The only letters that seemed to fit were P and D, so that this last message, when complete, read, Elsie, prepare to meet thy God. In the earlier messages, he was only asking her to come to him, but this was more serious. I came to Ridlingthorpe Manor immediately with my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. But I was too late.
It's an honour to work with you, Mr. Holmes,
said the inspector with sincere admiration.
but I'm afraid this Abe Slaney may escape while we sit here talking.
No, he won't escape. He'll be here soon. I sent him a message, asking him to come.
Just then, the doorbell rang,
Ah, here he is.
cried Holmes.
Inspector Martin, get your handcuffs ready.
Holmes took out his gun and stood behind the door. The servant opened the door, and a tall, dark, good-looking man entered. Holmes stepped out from behind the door and put his gun to the man's head. Martin put the handcuffs on the man's wrists. It was all done so quickly that the man did not have time to react. He looked angrily at Holmes and said,
I've come here in answer to a letter from Mrs. Cubitt.
Mrs. Cubitt has been shot. She might die.
Slaney gave a great cry of grief.
Oh, you're mad!
He cried.
He was shot, not her. I love her too much to hurt her.
She was found badly injured, next to her dead husband,
Said Holmes.
I've nothing to hide.
Said Slaney.
I shot Hilton Cubitt, but he shot at me first, so it wasn't murder. I had a right to do it. Elsie was engaged to marry me years ago. Her father approved of the engagement. What right did this Englishman have to come between us?
She chose to leave you because she didn't like your life of crime.
Said Holmes.
She left America to escape from you. You followed her and made her life miserable. You wanted her to leave her husband, whom she loved and respected, to go with you, whom she feared and hated. Now you've caused the death of a noble man, and you've made his wife kill herself. That's what you've done, Mr. Abe Slaney, and the law will punish you for it.
The best thing I can do is to tell the truth.
Said Slaney.
I'm a member of an organization in Chicago called The Joint. Elsie's father is the boss of The Joint. He invented that code of the dancing men. No one outside The Joint could understand it.
He stopped and looked confused.
If Elsie's as ill as you say, who wrote that message to me?
I did.
Said Holmes.
You?
Cried Slaney in amazement.
Yes. Please continue your story.
She was engaged to be married to me, but she hated The Joint. She wanted an honest life, so she left me. I had no idea where she had gone until she married that Englishman. I read about that in the newspaper. I wrote her letters, but she didn't reply. So I came to Norfolk and rented a room at Elridge's farm. At night, I came here and left messages for her. Finally, she wrote me a letter asking me to go away. Come to the window at the end of the house at 3 o'clock in the morning, she wrote. I'll come and talk to you. But after that, you must promise to go away and leave me in peace. I came to the window, and she was there. She offered me money to go back to America. That made me angry. I took her arm, trying to pull her through the window to come with me. She fell down on the floor. Just then, her husband appeared, holding a gun. He fired at me and missed. I fired back and hit him. Then I ran away. As I left, I heard the window shutting behind me.
2 policemen came in and took the prisoner away. Holmes picked up a piece of paper that Slaney had left on the table.
Can you read it, Watson?
He said. I looked at the paper. It contained no words, just this line of dancing men. Holmes smiled and said,
It simply means, come here at once. I knew that it was an invitation he couldn't refuse. He thought it was from the lady, you see.